Tonight we're hosting a conversation between two Australian foreign and security affairs heavyweights on the theme of the World Outlook for 2021. Once again, we are live streaming the event online with a small COVID-safe but lively audience at the AIIA National Conference Centre here in Canberra. Dennis Richardson is one of Australia's most highly regarded public servants. He has unparalleled experience in the practice of foreign and security relations, with appointments as Prime Minister Bob Hawke's Chief of Staff, Australia's Ambassador to Washington, Director General of ASIO, and Secretary of the Departments of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Defence. Since retiring in 2017, he's kept active on government committees, media engagements with Barry Cassidy and on Q&A, and in various directorships, including on the board of the Canberra Raiders. Sorry about that, Dennis. Better luck next year.
Okay.
Dennis is no stranger to this branch, which he has addressed on several occasions, including at our annual dinner a few years ago. We're delighted that our National President, Allan Gyngell, will engage Dennis in conversation tonight. It's appropriate, as they have known one another for a long time as members of the celebrated class of 1969 recruits to the External Affairs Department. Allan has a long career in foreign and intelligence policy as Prime Minister Paul Keating Senior International Advisor and Director General of the Office of National Assessments. Outside government, Allan was the founding director of the Lowy Institute for International Policy and has written extensively on Australia's relations in foreign policy. He's the author of the acclaimed Fear of Abandonment, Australia in the World Since 1942, which was published in 2017, the year he became AIIA National President. Now, following the conversation, I'll ask for questions from both our in-house audience and our online participants out there via the Q&A function on Zoom, with which I'm sure you're all now most familiar. We will aim to answer as many questions as time allows and finish at 7 p.m. So without any further ado, let me hand over to Allan to lead the conversation with Dennis.
Well, thank you very much, Heath, and thanks to the ACT branch, which is my own local branch of the AIIA, where I'm a member. It's terrific to be here and to have this opportunity to talk to Dennis Richardson. Now, this was billed, as Heath said, as a conversation between Dennis and me, but in point of fact, and you hinted at this, Heath, it's a continuation of a conversation which has been going on since we were both 21 years old and arrived in this town at the same time together to join what was then the Department of External Affairs. Time has passed since then, you may note by looking at us both, but the conversation we've had over those years through different continents and countries and jobs has really all revolved around the same question. How should Australia best operate in the world in ways that advance our interests and protect the values that we believe in? So there's a deep background to the discussion today. The topic we're going to sort of hang our conversation on is the world in 2021. I want to begin with what's happening in the world out there, and then move back home to a few questions about how well prepared Australia is to deal with what's coming, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience here. Dennis, you and I have lived through a number of really big changes in the international system. I suppose the first in our professional life was the United States withdrawal from the region after the Vietnam War and the Guam Doctrine of Nixon. We were both around for the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. You were directly in the middle of things in ASIO during 9/11 and what followed from that. Since then, we've had the global financial crisis, and now all of whatever is going on in the world now, made worse by a pandemic. So I wanted to ask you what you make of this time. Everyone says this is a fundamental period of change. Do you agree with that? And what are the important changes, do you think, from Australia's point of view?
Okay, thanks, Alan. I just might say, by way of introduction, Alan and I have coffee with a couple of other people every Saturday. So every Saturday morning we solve the world's problems. But for some reason, when we wake up Sunday morning, they're all still there. So we're obviously not very good at solving anything. Having said that, I think people tend to overhype fundamental change. People are always talking about fundamental change, and very often you don't realise what has been fundamental until after the event. Sometimes you do. Quite obviously, everyone in this room lived through the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Berlin Wall.
Everyone in this room may have lived through the end of the Cold War.
Well, yeah, I regret. You're quite right. The majority of people here, and with the bringing down of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, that was obviously dramatic, and that was obviously going to change the world big time. 9/11, the implications of that didn't quite become clear until the US went into Iraq, which led to a lot of other change.
And those implications weren't intrinsic to what was happening from the beginning. Development after development, spiraled off in different directions.
Oh yeah, and people forget that in the 2000 presidential election, candidate Bush became the first US presidential candidate to declare China to be a strategic competitor, accusing the Democrats of being too soft on China. The 9/11 came along, Iraq came along, and that issue took a back seat for quite a while, but it was still bubbling along. The pandemic, I don't think we'll know what real impact the pandemic has had globally, internationally, for some years. We all have our views at the moment. People immediately say the US will be weaker, China will be stronger. We certainly know that the developed world generally will be poorer. We know that now simply because of the debt that we are accumulating. I think more important than the pandemic are the changes that we were seeing before the pandemic and which are continuing to this day. The mistrust of government globally, the rise of authoritarianism, the increased power of government in both democracies and in non-democratic countries, the questioning of the multilateral order, which we lived with for a long time. Some of that you can well understand when you see the countries that get elected to the Human Rights Commission and the like. However, I suspect that if you didn't have the UN, you would have to invent it. I think the questioning of, the rise of nationalism, the increase of protectionist sentiment globally, the decoupling in certain strategic areas of the commercial trading links between the US and China and the implications that might have globally.
On decoupling, do you think that this will be a contained process, or do you see an increasing sort of division in the world into two competing technological spheres?
I think over time, if future US administrations pursue policies similar to the Trump administration, where there is an active policy to prevent China becoming, quote, number one, unquote, then there will be continued decoupling. How far that goes, I don't know.
Well, that naturally brings us to the question of what all this means for Australia. How does Australia's world look different from the one that sort of everyone has grown used to from the sort of late 20th, early 21st century?
Oh, I'm not quite sure, Alan. I mean,
But you said we were going to be poorer.
Yeah, well, we will be, but so will a lot of the rest of the world. What the region will be like, I'm not quite sure. How Indonesia emerges from the pandemic, how other leading countries in the region emerge from the pandemic, I'm not sure. I think people always want to jump to the dramatic, and I see more continuity than what I see discontinuity. We constantly hark back to the Cold War years. Well, that was only a period of time between 1947 and 1992. I was in government between 1969 and 2017. I spent more of my years working in government post-Cold War than what I did during the Cold War. And when you look at the way the world was locked in two competing blocks, more or less, despite the fact there was a big, if you like, non-aligned movement. But if you look at those two big blocks, that was really a very unusual period of time in history. I think we're back to more like the world has spent most of its time over the centuries.
Yeah.
And also, regardless of what happens with China, the world in which China might emerge number one is very different to the world in which the US was number one. Regardless of how big and powerful China becomes, the United States will remain militarily a superpower for many decades to come. Western Europe will remain an important block or grouping, if it survives, if it keeps together, of around 300-400 million people. You've got India, you've got Japan and others. The US was 50% of the global economy at the end of the Second World War, still 30% in the 70s. It's still around, in nominal terms, 20-24%. China just won't be the dominant number one in the way in which the US was the dominant number one. It's going to be a lot of moving parts. And that's the way the world has been for most of the last 500 years.
Yeah, it has, but Australian foreign policy hasn't been around for the last 500 years. And so
True.
we're going to, what do you think, how do you think we need to adjust to this? Because it's a very common, commonly expressed view now, but we had, if you wanted to design a system that suited us perfectly, you would design the system between the Chinese reform period after the late 1980s and the GFC, an alliance with the most powerful state in the world, and a really strong complementary economic relationship with the fastest growing economy. So it was simple, really, in a way. Our period in government, we knew where we had to, head and do it. I think it's much more complicated for people for this generation. So what do you think?
All right. Well, one, it depends upon how we manage our own domestic economy. because unless you're economically strong, then there's a limit to what you can do in other arenas. That is going to in part depend upon the trading relationships we have and how we manage them. That will then in part depend upon the degree to which we're prepared to invest in our diplomatic efforts. We're going to have to depend more on ourselves. I think we'll continue to have a powerful alliance with the United States. Obviously, the relationship with China is more complex now and is going to become trickier. I think we need to be putting more effort into Southeast Asia. With the Pacific step up, that's fine, but that's easy. Southeast Asia is where the big challenger is. The developing relationship with India, Japan and the like. We're not in a bad place in the sense that we have a lot of the things the rest of the world wants. We're a highly educated society. We're relatively wealthy. We're relatively good at diplomacy. We have the 15th, 16th largest economy in the world. Our defence budget is about the 14th largest in the world in absolute dollar terms. Of the 193 countries in the UN, we've got a bigger population than about 140 of them. We're small compared to the really big guys, but we're bigger than most others. We're not badly placed, provided we're smart enough.
Okay, well, let's go through some of the issues you just raised and begin with the great unknown, which is the US election in 2 weeks. When you were, of course, ambassador in the United States, and with great determination, I think it's true to say you drove to every one of the. You didn't just visit every one of the contiguous United States. You actually drove to them, which enabled you to talk to every member of Congress and say, I was in your state or your area recently. So look, no one knows what's going to happen, but chance, give it a chance. What's your gut instinct?
Oh, my gut is that I think Biden will win. If you look at the real clear politics average of polls and the like, Biden has a good margin at the moment. Trump is running hard. I can understand why Trump is getting out. Other people might tut at his big rallies, but I think for him, that is probably the right thing to do. He's energising his base. He wants his base to get out there on election day. And I think by having the rallies that he's having is probably doing that. If you go back to 2016, 10 days out from the polls, the FBI director pulled his little stunt and reopened the investigation into Clinton emails. He closed that down 3 days before the election. That had a big impact, I think, on the polls. Something like that I doubt will happen again. We have the election tomorrow. Oh, sorry, not the election, the debate tomorrow. It'll be an important test for Biden to get through that. I think the fact that they're going to have the non-speaker on silent so there can't be interruption, I think poses a bigger challenge for Biden than what it does for Trump, because he's going to have to speak in 2-minute lots and not get his words mumbled. If he does that successfully, I think he's probably on the path to win. The only proviso I would say that I am personally aware of some companies doing private polling in the US, which has it a lot closer than what the published polls are saying. Now, how credible they are, I don't know, but I am getting feedback in respect of some of them. My own instinct is that Biden will win.
Okay. What's at stake for Australia in the results? Do you think? I mean, there's a tendency here to treat the relationship with the United States and the alliance, which are different things, but as sort of permanent natural features of the international landscape. If it is Trump, what do you think will happen to the...
Well, you and I have a difference on that, Alan. I don't believe the alliance will... I think the alliance will survive another 4 years of Trump. I believe the relationship will survive another 4 years of Trump. I think commentators who write arrogantly about, well, if Trump is re-elected by the American people, that means the American people no longer share our values and therefore we should go our own way. I think that's one, awfully arrogant. And secondly, I think it fails to understand the fact that Trump is popular and for good reason with sections of the American electorate. He has followed through on his promises, even though some of them were unpopular. He's delivered in respect of the Supreme Court. Prior to the pandemic, he had unemployment at record low levels. Unemployment for Black Americans was at record lower levels. He's done some justice reform which has particularly benefited some Black Americans. So there are good reasons why some Americans would in fact vote for Trump for very positive reasons. I think the interesting thing, if Trump does get re-elected, will he be more conventional or will he continue down his totally unconventional road in terms of his relationships with allies, his relationships with North Korea, Russia, and the like? Bush is earmarked by Iraq in his first term, and yet when you look at his second term, it was very similar to Clinton.
Yeah.
Whether Trump goes that way, I don't think he will. Therefore, he's going to test us, and the relationship with China will really start to tear in opposite directions, and that's going to test us.
Yeah, well, that's right. Well, I think we do have a slightly different view. My own sense is that the deep bipartisan commitment to the alliance, which has been such a feature of the Australia-US relationship, with both sides of politics claiming the origin story, and you would have heard them, every Labor member who goes to Washington and stands up and says, this was all John Curtin and the turn to America, and every Liberal who goes there says this was all Percy Spender and Robert Menzies and the ANZUS alliance. And that's been a fantastically important and useful thing in our relationship. I'm just not as confident as you that 8 years of Trumpism sustains this sort of strong bipartisan support. Anyway, look, moving on from that, we're running out of time. I do want to talk about China a bit. One of the I've heard you say a number of occasions in public in the past that when asked about Australia and its relationship with the United States and China, that we are a friend to both, but an ally to one. Is that still possible?
In the recent past, that was a reality. Today, it's an aspiration. If you read the AUSMEN communique of 2018, that is 2 years ago. It talked about the importance of having a constructive engagement with China. Read the communique of 2020, there's no such sentiment in it. So today it is an aspiration.
Yeah. But it's an aspiration you think Australia should hold?
Oh, it's an aspiration consistent with what I would consider to be our national interests.
Okay. Managing the relationship with China is obviously a very, complicated and difficult issue for Australia, because unlike other relationships we've had in the past, important ones, for example, the relationship with Japan, this one is deeper and more multifaceted, not least because we've got 1.2 million Australians of Chinese heritage here. You were the Director General of Security, the head of ASIO for a long time, so you're familiar with all the issues of espionage and foreign interference. How should we be dealing with this? A big debate going on at the moment on the foreign interference legislation, the new foreign relations legislation, which we can talk about if we've got time, but if not, what's your view on how?
Well, I think, one, I understand where the government is coming from, and I support where the government is coming from. However, actual implementation of foreign interference legislation is going to be very tricky. There a lot of people confuse the legitimate role of governments to influence as opposed to interference. One of the reasons why you have diplomatic missions, as everyone in this room knows, is to influence other countries. We have diplomatic missions overseas. We seek to influence the policy outlook of all our neighbours, Pacific, Indonesia. We spent a lot of time in Beijing trying to influence the Chinese. We spent a lot of time in Washington seeking to influence the Americans. We do that through formal representations. We do it informally. We have dinners. We do all sorts of stuff to seek to influence formally and informally. If we're not careful, some of the paranoia in this country is going to confuse legitimate diplomatic activity by some missions in Canberra with foreign interference. I was out at a dinner a couple of nights ago, and at the restaurant, at a nearby table, was Bill Shorten. And he was at a table with two other Anglo-Saxons and a person from somewhere in Asia, right? One of the people I was sitting with, none of them were from a foreign policy background, whispered to me, Bill Shorten's over there. He looks as though he's having dinner with someone from China. Anyway, he was in fact having dinner with a representative from Korea. Now, we're in a bad place when that happens. The Chinese ambassador in Canberra should be able to have dinner with whoever he wants, and whoever wants to have dinner with him should be able to, without their loyalty and integrity being called into question. And we are creeping into an environment in which that's being questioned.
Yeah, it's been questioned particularly for the Australian Chinese community, as we saw examples of during the week when members of that community were asked in testimony before the Parliament to formally denounce the Communist Party of China as though any Australian is required to take a loyalty test.
Totally, Alan. When I was in ASIO in 2002, 2003, I spent a Saturday with Australian Islamic community leaders from around the country. One of them asked how he and his community could prove to their fellow Australians that they were loyal to this country. And I said to him, the fact that you asked that question means that we in ASIO and elsewhere in government have failed. No Australian should have to prove their loyalty. And I wrote about that subsequently in an opinion piece in the Australian, and we're in a bad place if Australian Chinese feel they have to prove their loyalty. Now, there's a parallel in terms of foreign interference and counterterrorism. In counterterrorism, you have to be uncompromising and you have to be ruthless in going after the bad guys. You give no quarter. But you must do that on an individual basis, and you must seek to do it in a way in which whole communities don't feel threatened. And the trick in foreign interference is going to be to nail where we should be nailing without whole communities feeling that they're being questioned.
I wanted to touch just briefly on Southeast Asia before we end. He's looking a bit nervous at me over there. You were at an early stage of your career. You had a job which I always envied you, which was head of the political section in the
Heath and I were together.
Embassy in Jakarta. Which I always thought must be the best job in the Australian Foreign Service. Southeast Asia, as you were saying before, has become increasingly central to the government's strategy for dealing with the Indo-Pacific. The idea that we must establish balancing relationships across the Indo-Pacific, as you were saying, India, Japan, but Southeast Asia is obviously at the linchpin of that Southeast Asia. Why do we get Indonesia so wrong in Australia? I've said before, but if I want to be reliably depressed every year, I simply have to turn to the annual Lowy poll and read how many Australians are suspicious of Indonesia, don't believe that Indonesia is a democracy, and it's a sort of mystery to me.
Well, there are probably others. John was ambassador there, so he'd probably have a better answer than me. But look, it's always been a government-led relationship. If you go back to the 50s, the Australians have always been a bit suspicious, re-Indonesia. A lot of Indonesians suspicious of Australia. Many Indonesians to this day believe that we have an objective of separating Papua from the rest of Indonesia. In part, that's been given more substance because of the role some Indonesians consider that we played in respect of East Timor. But it's always been a government-led relationship. And I think it's going to have to remain a government-led relationship. Everyone knows the story of Indonesian language in Australian schools. Everyone knows how some of that is turned down and the like. Everyone is aware that the trading relationship isn't as big as you would expect. However, I don't know whether governments have got the relationship wrong. If you go just about every big regional issue over the last 60 years, we've played a leading role in respect of Southeast Asia. If you go back to the Korean War, you go back to the Malaysian emergency, you go back to Konfrontasi, you go back to the formation of ASEAN, and we were the first dialogue partner. You go back to the role we played in addressing the outflow of refugees from Vietnam at the end of the Vietnam War, and rightly or wrongly our role in the Vietnam War. You go back to our role in the Cambodian peace process, the emergence of East Timor, the Asian financial crisis of 97, 98, the global financial crisis, the tsunami of 2004. The question mark I have is what role is Australia playing today and what engagement are we involved in terms of the pandemic in Southeast Asia. I'm not really up to date with what the government is or isn't doing in Southeast Asia, but it has surprised me a little that the government hasn't been more on the front foot in terms of that issue. In respect to the Pacific we have, but the Pacific is pretty easy work for Australia. The challenge is, the bigger challenge is in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, West Asia, depending on, etc. That is the bigger challenge for us. And while we have big missions in those countries, I'm just not quite sure to the extent of our engagement.
Okay, well, on that note, I'll hand over to Heath to moderate the rest of the discussion.
All right.
Thanks very much, Dennis.
Well, thanks, Alan and Dennis. We've got time for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes for questions. We're happy to take a few from the floor now, and then we'll pass to our online audience to get their questions across. So does anybody have a question they might like to bring to Alan? Or if you could stand and say who you are and speak up for the one microphone that we have.
Yes, my name's Colin Naslin. I've worked in Defence, Navy, and also Foreign Affairs and Trade. You were talking earlier about speculation as to the outcome of the presidential election and what would be in Australia's best interests. I've heard it said within the department that irrespective of who wins the presidential election, that at the working level, department to department, if you like, State Department to Foreign Affairs, Defence to Defence, that will endure irrespective of who is president, because that relationship is still very strong. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, yes, that's right. That day-to-day bread and butter relationship will continue, but I think the political framework within which that is conducted is really what we're talking about. And certainly the Biden, for instance, if Biden gets elected, he will continue to be protectionist. Democrats normally are. He's not going to rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or not rejoin, he's not going to join it. He will continue to want allies to do more in terms of defence. However, he will be less robust in his language. However, if he reduces his own country's defence spending, then that could undercut his request for other countries to step up and do a little bit more, although it could put the acid on them in an interesting way. He'll be more multilaterally focused. He will do more in respect of climate change and he will need to be able to cooperate with China on climate change. So there will be differences if Biden does become president. Democrats have sent some good ambassadors here. The last couple of Bleish and Berry, really, really good. However, it depends who Biden has as Foreign Secretary, has State, Department of State, Defence Secretary and the like. For instance, John Kerry. John Kerry came to Australia in 2014 for AUSMID. He was over 70 years old and he had been chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It was the first time in his life he'd ever set foot in Australia. I do hope. Hillary Clinton, however, she was a Democrat Secretary of State. She became the first Secretary of State since Dean Rusk in 1961 to visit Asia before visiting Europe. So it depends what kind of Democrat we get.
Do you have a comment on that?
No, that's sensible.
Is there another question from the floor? Well, I see Ernst's hand up already.
And Ernst Wilhelm, retired. Dennis, in response to Alan's rather open question on how should Australia adapt, part of your response was to invest in our diplomatic service, which leads me to raise an issue which has concerned me for a long time, that our defence expenditure is increasing very dramatically, including in a lot of equipment which a lot of commentators like Hugh White suggest is the wrong sort of equipment. And at the same time, the budget for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is reduced. Do you think we have the right balance between defence and foreign affairs, or defence and diplomacy? And should we be putting more effort into our diplomacy?
I don't think of it in terms of balance. I don't believe a single dollar should be taken out of defence to put into foreign affairs and trade. I believe foreign affairs and trade does need an injection of capital. I believe we should invest more in our diplomatic service. We have one of the smallest diplomatic footprints of any of the G20s. However, I gave a speech in 2011 when I was Secretary of DFAT, in which I said I didn't believe that 2% of GDP would be sufficient to buy the defence capability we would need in the 2020s. And I believe that to this day. I believe we should be spending 2 to 3% of GDP on defence. We should also be spending more in our diplomatic effort. But I don't think in terms of taking one to pay for the other.
I might take a question from our online audience, Dennis. A question about human rights in China. How does that impact Australia's relationship with that country?
I don't believe it should be the centrepiece of our relationship with China. It is clearly, as a liberal democracy, human rights are important to us. We will always express our views in respect of human rights issues in China, whether it be Hong Kong, whether it be the Uyghurs, etc., as we should, but it should not be the centrepiece of our relationship.
On another tack, the question of nuclear security. Do you have a comment about Australia's policy in terms of the arms race in Southeast Asia or other parts of the world?
Oh, I don't think there's much of an arms race in Southeast Asia. I think there is increased defence spending in Southeast Asia, as you would expect, given the rise of their economies. There's a more serious issue in respect of China, particularly regarding the South China Seas. But I think provided we continue on the trajectory we are with our defence spending, I think that's about right. I'd just like to see it lift a bit. I'd like to see us spending a few billion more on defence.
So where do you come out on Hugh White's sort of dangling of the issue of the need for Australia to become a nuclear?
I think that is, Hugh White's book, which is predicated on, how to defend Australia, that was predicated on China invading Australia a la the 1940s. I don't quite buy that as a working premise. I find it difficult to believe. I find it difficult to perceive the situation where Australia and China would be in a war isolated from other conflicts. To me, the question of Australia having nuclear weapons doesn't arise. If you genuinely believed Australia could be at war with China and no other country involved, I think you'd need more than you'd need more than Hugh's conventional submarines.
Dennis, on another international topic, one of our questioners is asking, how do you rank climate change as a threat to global stability?
I think I can't add anything more to what others know. That climate will become an increasing issue for countries. It'll be reflected in disputes over water. It'll be reflected in, and you're starting to see some of that now. Climate change, I would follow the water. And yeah, it'll be simply a growing issue.
Well, are there any questions further from the floor at this stage?
Desmond Woods, Australian Naval Institute. It seems to me that the dragon in the room is Taiwan. In decades gone by, it would have been quite easy to have said that Taiwan was not a democracy and not a place in which we had to invest any particular principles. That isn't true any longer. It's a multi-party democracy and in very many respects is one of the democratic Western club. We don't have to imagine a situation of full invasion to imagine pressure being put on it, which would be regarded, I think, by many of us as unacceptable. I'm thinking in terms of blockade by air and by sea. Xi Jinping and his generation have led the Chinese people to believe that inevitably it will become part of the motherland once again before the centenary of the revolution in 2047. Now, what should Australia's attitude be towards this very potent threat to a democratic neighbour?
Well, you pace that out over time. I don't think China's about to invade Taiwan. They will continue to impose pressure on Taiwan. Don't forget, Taiwan also claims to be part of mainland China, in the sense that they claim China. So Beijing and Taipei have had a unity ticket on that one, depends where you sit. I think, should we allow the mere, I'll say something controversial, should we, the mere fact that a country is democratic, should that automatically mean that every other democracy should come to that country's defence? I don't know.
What would it say about us and the West if we didn't?
Well, it would say a lot. But I remember I was at a program at Harvard in 1990, and one of the programs was led by a fellow who was articulating a view that democracies, the good thing about democracies was they never went to war with one another. And I said I didn't believe that principle had been tested for very long. And he went through a whole series of things. I said, well, I think by the standards of 1990, the US wasn't a democracy until after the civil rights movement. And Australia arguably was not a democracy until after we recognised our own Indigenous people as being citizens of our own country. So I said I didn't think democracies in the sense that we described them in 1990 had been around for a long time. We would be under a lot of pressure. If China invaded Taiwan tomorrow, the US would unquestionably expect us to be involved. And probably, whether we liked it or not, we would be involved through joint facilities that exist in Australia. So I think if in the unlikely event that China did something physical and actually invaded Taiwan anytime soon, I sense we would find ourselves involved.
I just had a couple
whether
of,
we liked it or not.
I just had a couple of points to that. One is that the Australian government acknowledges China's claim to Taiwan. That's why we don't have an embassy there. We have an economic mission. So we begin from a position of wanting Taiwan to have greater international personality, but our formal position is that it's not a sovereign state in the way that others are. But more to the point, the thing you have to think very hard about then is that you are talking about great power war, between the United States and China. So Australia would be it seems to me inconceivable that if China were to move to invade Taiwan, that it would back away because the Americans said don't do it. So I think you are headlong into major global warfare. What Australia does or doesn't do in that catastrophic event is a really minor issue. The objective has to be to avoid that by working as hard as we can in every diplomatic channel available to us to make sure that doesn't happen.
And I just add, if Taiwan has a history in respect of US and China. If Taiwan wasn't as democratic as it is today, it would still be a factor and you would still have that question. The mere fact that it is a democracy simply adds another element to it. It is not the all-powerful element.
The Taiwan Relations Act predates.
Yes, precisely. Yeah.
Could I just add a point there?
Yeah.
Look, one thing which I don't think is missing.
I need to speak up a bit, John.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
One thing that is missing in the debate here in Australia about China and the United States is very, very relevant to Taiwan. If the Chinese were to challenge on Taiwan and the United States were not to respond, confidence in the United States and the rest of the region, above all Japan, would be very seriously affected, quite apart from our role. And I think we need to think more about that aspect of the issue rather than just where it concerns us.
Emily, you're John.
Hi, Emily from the University of
Picking up.
Is there anything that China could do short of an invasion of any country really that you think would affect Australia's relationship with them?
Oh yeah, I mean,
They've had protests for months, like along those lines, or maybe
yeah, but
in between.
what do you mean?
Is there anything that would get Australia to impose tariffs or any sort of economic sanctions or to lessen trade with China, other than?
Oh, in extremis, yes, but I don't. I think we're a long way off that.
Well, we've already done it in a way, haven't we? I mean, the decisions on matters like Huawei and 5G are already decisions that we've taken in an economic sense to limit engagement with China.
And as our Vice President, Zara Kimpton, National Vice President Zara Kimpton is asking, is there a danger that China in discouraging students from coming to Australia and also that making less of a demand for our raw materials for political reasons could complicate our relationship?
Oh, it could. I personally believe in any contest between trade and strategic interests, I think our strategic interests will come first. I think both sides of politics would put our strategic interests before our trading interests in extremis. However, the trick of diplomacy is to avoid that. The trick of diplomacy and the challenge before us is to engage with China, manage our relationship in a way that does not put those sorts of interests at stake, while at the same time having clear boundaries in respect of foreign interference and being prepared to publicly articulate our reasonable position in respect of the South China Sea, Hong Kong, etc.
Amanda, did you have a question?
Yeah, Amanda Lynch, AIIA Councillor, ACT branch. My question is actually political. During your time with Bob Hawke, that was a relative period of stability with Hawke, Keating, Howard. Then we went through a period of changing prime ministers frequently. Just interested in your perspective about how that was perceived externally, because there were comments that Australia was a laughing stock. And do you think it's much more difficult to be a leader at the moment during the last decade and the tumultuous times we've had and we're still having?
Yeah, I don't think we were ever a laughing stock. We joked about it amongst ourselves, and a lot of other countries had their jokes. But by gee, I think just about every country has taken their turn at being laughed at one way or the other over different period. It didn't bother me. And I thought, you know, it certainly surprised some people. I was at a dinner at the Lodge that Prime Minister Rudd had for the visiting Chinese then Vice President, Xi. Yeah, and that was on a Sunday night. And when Xi was in Darwin on the Wednesday, there was a change of Australian Prime Minister, and Xi turned immediately to the Australian ambassador, or no, to his own ambassador, and demanded to know why he wasn't told about this. And the Chinese ambassador, poor bugger, had to explain that no one knew about it. Yeah, so there were some funny moments.
No.
That's right. There was some certainly a lot of. I think it is very difficult for leaders. Look, we live at a time where all of us are diminished by everyone else. There is less confidence in government. There is less confidence in the public service. There is less confidence in lawyers. There is less confidence in doctors. There is less confidence in academia. There is less confidence in the media. Everyone has a go at everyone else. And we do live in an environment in which we do seek to tear down people of standing and institutions of standing. And whether that's temporary, whether it's longer term, where it leads to, I don't know. But I think it's a damn difficult time to be a Prime Minister of any country.
Dennis, I might get the last question in if I could.
Sure.
You've mentioned Southeast Asia tonight, but if I could ask about ASEAN as an institution and whether you see Australia's role with that organisation being developed further and providing Australia a way of engaging more credibly with the region, or is ASEAN too much of a autonomous being?
Well, I think you've got to devote a certain amount of effort in respect of ASEAN, but I think probably the balance of your effort has to be bilateral with the countries. Then you have, because ASEAN, as you know, as well as I do, Heath, it works on consensus and the difficulties that involves, given the current membership, given the various relationships that different one of them have with China and the like. So yes, a degree of effort in respect of ASEAN to be taken seriously, to be respected and to seriously engage with, but you don't do that at the expense of your bilateral engagement.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, here and at home, I think we might draw a line under that. I just want to say on behalf of the ACT branch, thank you so much, Dennis, for your very normally frank and forthright comments tonight. We've covered a lot of ground, and also indeed to Allan for leading the conversation. And so could I call on us all to show our appreciation the normal way. Before everyone at home switches off, I'd like to put in a bit of a plug for non-members taking part online. We would encourage you to sign up as members of the ACT branch. We think we've got an interesting program going forward and we would benefit from your support. So have a look at our website for details. Our next event is a talk on Australia's role in the space race with Anna Moore, who is the director of the ANU Institute of Space. We expect that in November, so look forward to seeing you then. And good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.